Would you like me?
Hello, hi. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Alqaed, and I am the Director of Programs at Gulf International Forum. We are pleased to welcome you today on this important panel to talk about a timely and important program, the conflict in Sudan and the GCC states' role as well in the conflict. 2 months and a half ago, the violence broke out across Sudan between the country's armed forces, led by General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, and the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces, RSF, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, more famous as Hemedti. Although the conflict began in Khartoum as a struggle for control over government buildings and military bases, the conflict eventually escalated and spread across the country, leading to dramatic escalation of violence and thousands of civilian deaths. Today, the United Nations announced that 2.2 million Sudanese were pushed outside their homes, either outside Sudan to the neighboring countries or internally displaced. And on top of that, there are thousands of casualties between death and injuries across Sudan, particularly in Khartoum and in Darfur. Over the last 2 weeks as well, Darfur, a region still healing from a horrific campaign of ethnic cleansing by the Janjaweed militia, the RSF predecessor organization, has been witnessing atrocities. The governor of Darfur has been kidnapped and killed, and there are reports of attacks on civilians, sexual violence against women and girls. And unfortunately, this only renewed the specter of crimes against the humanity in Darfur. Since the overthrow of the former President Umer al-Bashir from power, the GCC states' influence has increased and relations with the US resumed. And in January 2021, we saw Sudan joining the Abraham Accords. These are major shifts in the country's foreign policy, and not only making it closer to the US and initiating relations with Israel, but also changed the role of the GCC states in Sudan. In recent year, also we saw an increased Russian role in the country. Wagner Group has been playing a vital role in the Sudanese conflict, providing RSF with military support. Weapons have been supplied through military bases, Russian military bases in Syria, in Libya, and in Central African Republic. This has worried the Americans. American officials stated that Wagner is fueling the conflict in Sudan by providing surface-to-air missiles to the RSF. Secretary Blinken also pointed out that Wagner involvement in Sudan simply brings more death and destruction to the country. Since the violence erupted, the international community has arranged peace talks in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, with hopes to de-escalate the conflict, the tension. We've seen representatives from the armed forces and RSF have met to negotiate in Jeddah. The negotiations have been widely supported by Sudan neighbors, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, UAE, Qatar, Israel, South Sudan, United States, European Union, African Union, different international organizations and regional stakeholders in the region. However, these talks have made limited to no progress due in part to conflicting interests of the mediators and even, of course, the warring parties within the country. The US-Saudi initiative is the first serious attempt to end the infighting and has turned the war that turned part of Khartoum into war zones and derailed an internationally backed plan to transition to a civilian rule in Sudan after years of unrest and uprisings. To discuss all these topics and more, and receive your questions on this topic, we are joined by a line of excellent experts on Sudan and on the region. joining us from DC, from Egypt, from the Gulf, different places. Our speakers in order of speaking is we're going to start with Ms. Niemat Ahmadi, a native of North Darfur, the founder and president of Darfur Women Action Group, and the founder and CEO of Unique 22 LLC Strategies. She's a veteran human rights and genocide prevention activist and a seasoned strategic planning and management professional. Ms. Ahmadi previously worked as the director of global partnerships for United to End Genocide and at the Save Darfur Coalition. Second speaker today is Dr. Khalid Mustafa Medani. He's an associate professor of political science and Islamic studies and the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies and chair of the African Studies program at McGill University. He has also taught at Stanford University. Dr. Medani's research focuses on globalization and the political economy of Islamist and ethnic politics in Africa and the Middle East, with a special focus on Sudan, Egypt, and Somalia. Dr. Medani is the author of Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa. Third speaker is Mohamed Abu Bakr, is the president of African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, AMAL. Is a Sudanese human rights activist and peacemaker with a decade and a half of civil society experience. He founded and led organizations and initiatives focused on human rights, youth empowerment, and peace programs across the Middle East and Africa, including in Darfur, South Sudan, Egypt, Israel, the Palestinian territories, and beyond. Mohamed also documented, reported, and mobilized against the human rights abuses across the Middle East and Africa. Final speaker is Umer Karim. He's an associate fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies and doctoral researcher in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham. Previously, Umer was visiting fellow at RUSI in London. His academic research focuses on Saudi foreign policy and politics, in particular the Saudi regional policy outlook and the broader geopolitics of the Middle East. All our speakers' bio, these are parts of the bios, or our speakers' bio are available on the events page on our website. And we're going to start with Niemat, who will give us an introduction about the root cause of the current conflict and how clashes affect civilians in Darfur, Khartoum, and across the country. Niemat, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Anas. And I'm pleased to meet everyone here, to be among these distinguished speakers. Thank you to our audience. Speaking about the situation in Sudan today, it is really overwhelming, as I can put it. Since April 15th, the fighting between the two warring parties, unfortunately, two individuals who are fighting over power have put the entire country and the entire population of Sudan hostage and have forced them through unimaginable suffering. The situation in Khartoum, as I speak to you today, fighting, civilians are falling casualties as a result of direct fighting and killing of civilians by air bombing, by firing machine guns in the civilians' inhabitant areas, including destroying civilians' homes, destroying hospitals, other services, including water services, electricity, cutting access to communication. Today, communication become as important as basic needs, as food and water, because neighbors are unable to reach for help because they simply do not have access to communication. Occupation of civilians' homes by the rapid support forces, fighters, have contributed to unimaginable destruction of life and livelihood of people in inside Khartoum. Many people have been forced to flee. Many more are trapped in their homes. They cannot flee because they either cannot afford it, but or it's not safe for them to live where they are. Um, this is simply in Khartoum. While the situation in Khartoum is horrifying enough, and supposed to prompt the world to act, the situation in Darfur right now is beyond description. Darfur is rapidly falling under the rapid support forces control and completely falling out of any government control. Speaking about what is the situation look like right now in Darfur. Al Junaina, for instance, the whole West Darfur is completely fell under the control of rapid support forces, where um, genocidal attacks have been systematically committed against the African indigenous in Al Junaina. I think we are all shocked to see the the mass exodus of the population from Al Junaina who have been escorted out of their homeland by the rapid support forces who were cheering up, saying, now it is no longer Dar Masalit, it's now called Dar Arab. It is quite disturbing that it is an active process of displacing people and overtaking their land while killing, rape, and destruction of food and water. But this, why the attack is different in Darfur, because in Khartoum, civilians fall casualty as a result of the confrontation between the two forces. While in this is the situation in Khartoum, in Darfur, it is systematic attack against civilian with government army available in the city right there are not doing any attempt to protect civilians, as in the case of Al Junaina. Following Al Junaina, Zalingi has fallen under the rapid support forces control and has been completely cut of communication service as of now. Kapkabia has followed through. Tawila has been attacked and emptied completely from its population. Khartoum city, one of the largest after Al-Fashir in North Darfur, have been completely emptied of its population. Niala is majority of Niala city, the capital of South Darfur, is overtaken by the rapid support forces. People are forced to flee. Many diners and machine guns has fallen into people's home, killing uncounted number of people. People are unable to track how many people killed or how many people are missing because people are frantic and they're running for their life. They are unable to gather their family members. In Al Fashir, the rapid support force is partially controlling the city. Half the eastern side of the city is controlled by the rapid support forces, and the western side of the city is controlled by the military. But confrontation is going on and off every now and then, and civilians are caught in between. Many people attempted to flee from these other cities to reach Al Fashir. Only a few of them are able to make it because of lack of food, health assistance, and water down the way when they are fleeing to reach safety. So, what is the danger of allowing the rapid support forces controlling Darfur? This would result into um, them being stationed and relaunching another attack into the other areas that have yet to be attacked in Sudan, and that the control of Sudan by the rapid support forces will become inevitable. And these forces are not just locally driven, but they are multinational forces coming from Mali, Niger, Central African Republic, Chad, and Libya. So it is really dangerous. But the root cause of this is kind of simply about the situation, but the root causes are quite clear. Darfur has been going through this over the last 20 years. 3 million people have been driven out of their homes. They have yet to return because their attackers have yet to be apprehended or held accountable. And the basic problem in Sudan in the past, when the people of Darfur were going through genocide, the rest of Sudanese can have yet to pay attention. They were thinking probably it was the fault of the people of Darfur. Then the government have used ethnicity and tribalism to fuel crisis in Darfur by using the Arab ethnic groups against the indigenous Africans, and now those very militias have been emboldened when they were promoted to be in the highest office in the country, whereby Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo served as the vice president to al-Burhan. Both al-Burhan and Dagalo were close associates of Bashir, with credible allegation to have committed similar crime to al-Bashir's crime in Darfur. And the root causes of this crisis are the identity crisis. The Sudanese have the issue of Arabization versus Africanism, Islamization of the country, forcing some people, like people in the Nuba Mountains, into confining, and the two people of South Sudan before, into one religious, lack of tolerance, superiority and inequality, lack of enforcement or existence of the rule of law. Sudan has no permanent constitution. These are all issues that lack of equality and marginalization of most regions that inhabited by the indigenous African people, by the elite in the capital, and also the Muslim Brotherhood government that took over the power by coup d'etat, military coup, continue to oppress the people of Sudan and leading the country investing in militarization, and instead of investing in development and services or improving governance crisis. So I will stop here and will be happy to answer your question later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Niemat. Thank you so much. It was important to understand the root causes and the casualties, what is happening to the Sudanese, whether in Khartoum or Jenaina or other parts of Sudan. Dr. Khalid, if you can please give us your insight about how have the neighboring countries contributed to the crisis in Sudan, and also how they affected the current infighting that started 2.5 months ago, and what are the possible solutions for the unrest, whether from neighboring countries or from the GCC states. You are muted.
Thank you very much. First of all, like my colleague, Ms. Niemat, I wanted to thank for your, everyone, the Gulf International Forum for the invitation, and also for inviting me on this panel with these distinguished scholars and friends, in fact. So I really do appreciate that. I'm not going to rehearse the entire root causes because Ms. Niemat did such an excellent job highlighting the humanitarian crisis. But I just wanted to point out a couple of things that have to do with the relationship of this conflict to external actors. We don't have to go all the way back to the colonial period to understand that external actors in Sudan and in many African countries, of course, have been central to this conflict. In the case of Sudan in 1989, when the military coup occurred, led by the Islamist-backed military regime of Mohamed Umer Bashir, that was a turning point, I believe, in the sense that it was in this period where we had a greater authoritarian ideological regime, in this instant backed by the National Congress Party or the Islamist regime at the time. That was really crucial, and very much related to that, of course, was the formalization of the security apparatus and the beginning of the rise of the paramilitary militias, although they had been there in the past. That was a strategy on the part of the authoritarian regime of Umer Bashir to do two things: to put down the unrest in Darfur that Ms. Niemat articulated well, and the other was to put down any efforts at, number one, dissent in Khartoum and other parts of the country. That's a call for democracy. And number two, of course, also to prevent any internal coup. That process or that policy of factionalizing the security apparatus by spawning the Janjaweed and then the rapid support forces that now are under the leadership of Dagalo or Hemedti was a very important legacy in terms of the root causes of the present conflict. It also linked up Hemedti and the rapid support forces eventually to external actors. There are a number of external actors that became important for strategic reason that aided and abetted, in addition, of course, to the central government support of Hemedti for so many decades. One, of course, was the European Union that had saw in Hemedti someone who would be a bulwark against any kind of migration using Sudan as a third country, and millions of dollars were expended to support him. Another, and I think that your colleagues and my colleagues here and everyone I think is well aware, was the role of Hemedti sending mercenaries at the behest of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at the time during the war in Yemen. That, of course, at the time emboldened Hemedti and generated some of his strength, a great deal of it. And then another aspect of the external actors, as you mentioned, very crucially, that everyone is looking at now, is the role of the Wagner Group that plays a very important role in two things. One of them in helping to protect and secure Hemedti's gold mine and assets, which is really important. They also have trained, and now it's well known, the security forces, including the rapid support forces prior to this war, to put down dissent, the pro-democracy advocates. So here we have a constellation of different actors that have been involved. From there, I want to turn to, because we can, of course, detail, if you'd like, all of these different actors. Egypt, of course, is supportive so far of Burhan and the army, the Sudan Armed Forces, for two reasons. One of them, a fear of the democratization push on the part of Sudanese civil society, but most importantly, strategically interested in a reliable ally in Burhan and the Sudan Armed Forces in order to make sure that they outbid in their Ethiopia in their competition or tensions around the Nile waters, which I think that is crucial to really emphasize, because that really powers and underpins much of the strategic and thinking of the Egyptian government with respect to this conflict and whose side that they're interested in supporting. But I want to turn, if you don't mind, to the Gulf countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which are really the topic of, I believe, your theme today. And I think for listeners or others who are not familiar, there is a huge and a long relationship between the Gulf countries and Sudan. I'd like to mention in Arabic, for those who know Arabic, of course, here, and that is Bab al-Mandab, the very famous passage that really is the passage in the Arabian Peninsula from the Suez Canal that opens up to the Red Sea area. In Arabic, of course, in urban legend and Gulf urban Arabic legend, not so much Sudanese, is of course termed or translated as the Gate of Lamentation. And the idea here being that historically there was some seismic earthquake that separated the Gulf countries and the Arabian Peninsula from the Horn of Africa and Sudan specifically. So here I just wanted to highlight the long history. More importantly, the long history between the Gulf countries culturally and historically with the Horn of Africa. For those of us from the region, that is really central. But even more important, of course, is that you have strategic interest, issues of interest in natural resources in Sudan, investments in agriculture, and of course the strategic location of Sudan. I wanted to highlight this is because currently the interest on the part of the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and with America and also of course the United Arab Emirates, is the fact that this war, and I want to emphasize this point, this war actually threatens the Gulf a great deal. It threatens the Gulf countries in terms of their long-term objective of securing food security. As you know, over 80% of food in the Gulf is imported from other countries, and that becomes really important. This war, if you don't mind me saying, because we have discussed some of the root causes, undermines one of the long-held interests of the Gulf countries in Sudan. That is the agricultural resources that are so important in the long term. And this includes not only agricultural products, but also investments in livestock rearing. And here the Gulf of the Darfur becomes very important. So we have a number of different issues here, strategic and historical, that are extremely important. The food security issue is very important. So the instability in Sudan is something that must be taken account of. I want to also, for those who are not familiar, emphasize that since the 1970s, and particularly over the last decade, Gulf investments in natural resources, in agriculture and infrastructure amount to over 50 billion US dollars. 35 billion of that is Saudi Arabian investment in Sudan. And recently, Saudi Arabia has pledged an additional 15 billion before the war across different sectors for investment. The Gulf countries are the largest investors of foreign direct investment without any parallel of any other countries. And this is why the economic interest, in addition to the strategic, is really important to highlight. And I want to really kind of emphasize that. There are issues of crops that are very important and all forms of different investments. With the war in Ukraine, there's a great deal of issues associated with the rise of the food import bill in Egypt and, of course, the Gulf as well. The option of going to distance markets to import food away from the region is something that is very expensive in the long term and can actually undermine the Gulf interest, which is very, really important to emphasize. But I want to conclude by, if you don't mind, talking about the role of the Gulf specifically, just a few points that just to emphasize why the Gulf role in this conflict is so important and so vital. Number one is, of course, the food security issue, and there's a great deal of interest on the Gulf. There's the issue of protecting these billions of dollars of investment. I'm talking economically. There's, of course, an issue of cultural and historical relationship, not only culturally, but ethnically in parts of Sudan, including Durman, which is being bombed. That's very important. Another issue has to do with strategic rivalry. And here, I think that it's important for those interested in the Gulf Cooperation Council to understand its original mission of not only financial unity across the different Gulf economies, but also stability in the region. Sudan then can be actually a very important test case because it can actually be a successful test case to meet the mission of the Gulf Cooperation Council to begin with. And here also the strategic rivalry of other countries vis-a-vis the Gulf makes Sudan very strategic also with respect to, let's say, the Red Sea area, which is a place where you have Russia and Turkey vying for that control. This is just another asset. I know you're nodding your head because you need me to conclude, but I want to conclude with why I think the Gulf can actually play a successful role. But we have to kind of refine it. First, to understand the strategic and historical relationship. That means that is why there's a sustained intervention, sustained interest. This is not just an interest based on normative or cultural factors, but real strategic and investment interest associated with Sudan, and also opening up all of the African markets in competition at the moment with not only Russia, but China and other countries. Here, for Gulf Cooperation, GCC countries interested in a stronger regional kind of presence and influence, which of course is a central goal of the large Gulf GCC countries. Sudan here is an important test case. What can the Gulf countries do for those of us actually from Sudan interested in resolving the conflict? Number one is, as the scholars of the GCC have put forth outside of Sudan, actually from the Gulf, is that it can use its convening power, its diplomatic power, its economic pressure. The reason I rehearsed all of these issues associated with cultural history and strategic interest is that those assets can fuel conflict, as they have done in the past, if you give it to one warring party over another, or it can be utilized in order to put pressure, economic and diplomatic, and that in the context of the stalemate is actually very, very important. Another aspect associated with that is to play carrot and stick, that is provide economic assistance only in the context of kind of benchmarks in terms of achieving certain objectives. Another aspect, and here it's very, very important, I don't know how much to emphasize this, because I feel that has been extremely lacking, and that is the close relationship between the Gulf countries seeking to resolve the conflict or intervene, and their lack of strong relationship with IGAD, the regional bloc of the Horn of Africa. It is the African countries, the neighboring countries, who A, understand some of the very important dynamics of this kind of conflicts, and B, have a sustained economic interest. And this is why the IGAD countries, and I will predict, are going to be taking a greater role in this. And the Gulf Cooperation countries have a very important role to play. In terms of negotiations itself, and here, if you don't mind me being critical, negotiations over with just two warring parties absent a real understanding of how a ceasefire can be designed and implemented, requires really two things. One of them, the inclusion of civil society actors in Sudan that have been successful in resolving conflicts in other African countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia. And another very important aspect is to marry very quickly, immediately, not issues just of ceasefire, but issue that is the most central and at the heart of the conflict, and that is security sector reform. This position is one that the African countries are taking much stronger. In other words, the convening power of the Gulf countries and their interest in Sudan must actually be bridged by a real emphasis and an insistence on A, the inclusion of civil society actors like other countries have done in the context of conflict countries in Africa, and B, very importantly, to bring in the African countries and to insist on implementation of security sector reform, which is really very, very important. So if we bridge all of these together, the strategic and historical interest and the huge economic investment that really protects or may potentially safeguard the economic interest domestically of the GCC countries in the long term, we really understand why the GCC is not only invested in resolving the conflict for Sudanese, but it's really invested and should be, and they are, of course, invested in resolving this conflict for the interest, the long-term interest of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries themselves. That's why I think this forum is really important. What is missing is a real analysis, A, of the fact that this conflict is of a particular type, different from the other countries, and B, I want to conclude with this because the majority of Sudanese insist, and the Gulf Cooperation countries are really lack a vision of the difference of Sudan from other Arab and Gulf countries. That difference, among many, has to do with the will and the interest of the Sudanese population for a democracy. Not just stability, but a stability that's wrought from a democratic push that's non-racial, that's multi-ethnic. This is what makes Sudan much more similar to sub-Saharan African countries, as Ms. Niemat, I think, articulated. That vision of a different endpoint, a different regime type in Sudan must be central to the vision of the GCC. And that is something that's missing. And I think that if Mohamed's nodding his head, I'm going to pass it on to him and finish right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid. I can't think of a better way to put why GCC states should be involved in resolving this conflict and more invested in a civilian democratic Sudan. Civilian and democratic government in Sudan. Mohamed, if you can please give us your perspective on how the current situation affected the transition to democracy. What could be the U.S. role? What could be how the GCC states can play a positive role with the United States?
Well, my colleagues did a very good job at covering much of what I wanted to say, so that will make my life so much easier. Hi all, I'm joining you today from Doha and on my way to UAE to have a lot of meetings around this topic, and I can only hope that what I say today will not negatively impact my plans for this trip. It might, but it's a risk I'm willing to take. Thank you, Niemat, for highlighting the depth and of the catastrophe that is happening and much less reported in Darfur. This conflict has unknown number of victims. I've been interviewing victims and survivors from Al Geneina and from different parts of Darfur who made it to Chad over the past week, and the stories are reminiscent of 2003 Darfur. Things have turned really, really ugly, and I've been saying this for weeks, for 7-8 weeks now, that the war is only about to start, and I think we just hit a new high of how terrible things are getting, especially outside of Khartoum in areas where cameras and reporters are much less available. I will try to actually start where my colleague Khalid ended on the centrality of democracy and a different system to this entire issue of intervening effectively in Sudan. I think one thing that has detrimental effect on different U.S. initiatives towards Sudan, not only right now but over the past few years, is the fact that the U.S. has been shying away from addressing a core issue of regional spoilers actively involved in this in the situation in Sudan, and they're being hell-bent for an outcome that cannot be served with a democratic Sudan. Be it Egypt and its water and security interest, or the UAE and its God knows what is UAE trying to achieve by empowering this pseudo Wagner group in Sudan. And much like their president, al-Bashir being supported ideologically and blindly by Qatar, UAE is seem to be ideological about having an outcome where Sudan is ruled by Hemedti, as much as Egypt is invested in an outcome where Burhan is the only ruler of Sudan, even at the cost of bringing back Islamists to his southern borders. And all of these outcomes can never be served with a democratic Sudan. So the U.S. approach has to emphasize Sudanese people's will to have a different system of governance in Sudan. It cannot be a military dictatorship. It cannot be a militia dictatorship. And it cannot be anything that brings back Islamists back to power. The U.S. can and should really change how it's engaging in Sudan. What I could say have defined the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Sudan over the past 3 years is extreme laziness on the part of the U.S. and over-reliance on regional partners to achieve U.S. goals in Sudan, and which is never going to happen. The biggest spoiler to the GCC initiative, the Saudi initiative in Sudan right now, was no other than members of GCC, other members, UAE, as well as Egypt, and that idea of relying on regional partners in the GCC alone to achieve goals that are detrimental to member state is ridiculous at best. The issue of the other thing that has defined U.S. engagement in Sudan, recent engagement in Sudan, is there seems to be like treatment of this war in Sudan to in Khartoum to be happening in isolation from everything else that has been going on in the last 20 years, which really not accurate and not helpful way to see. I'm sorry, I'm keep hearing my own voice back. It's very distracting. Can you guys hear me?
We hear you well. There is no echo, so you can proceed. There is no echo. You can proceed. I think this is it's not affecting it.
But if you have headphones, that would help. You have headphones.
It's been from the minute
we hear you. We can't hear any echo. So yeah.
Okay. What I will do is just try to mute, turn the voice all the way down. So I don't hear myself, and just say what I want to say and then return back the voice. So, all right. Sorry. Yes. U.S. policy has to really has to really be serious vis-a-vis Sudan and serious about the outcome of having a democratic Sudan as part of the solution to the Sudanese problem. I really would love to see active encouragement of GCC members by the United States to be a positive influence, including the United Arab Emirates. As we have seen on the agenda of the United States of Antony Blinken's recent talks with UAE, Sudan did not even make it to the list. I really do not understand the U.S. Shyness from addressing the Sudan UAE problem head on, since it's absolutely detrimental to the U.S. efforts in the bigger picture. It's not a secret, the relationship between RSF, Wagner Group, and UAE, and the role that all of that plays in the bigger picture for the United States, including its war in Ukraine, and the effect, the negative effect that relationship between UAE, Russia, and RSF have on that outcome. I would love to see more serious addressing of UAE's ties to the Wagner Group and to Russia and their role in Sudan. And I would love to see also serious sanctions including global Magnitsky sanctions applied to not only Sudan gold in certain mines, but Sudan gold as a whole, as a way to limit the resources of the RSF and of Wagner Group at once. I'm sorry, I think I should turn back the voice just a little bit.
Okay. Did you conclude?
I keep hearing myself regardless, so I don't know what to do about that. So I think the best thing to do right now is to stop talking. I keep getting distracted by my own voice.
Thank you, Mohamed. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
Excellent. No, thank you, Umer. I think your mission now is a bit hard to. You got all the ideas, but also I hope you have more to add about the geopolitics rivalry of the GCC states. How has it affected their intervention or their role and influence in Sudan, and particularly the geopolitical interest in the Red Sea, and how Yemen also drove the relationship and the current trajectory and impact of the ongoing crisis.
Thank you so much, Anas, and a special thanks to the Gulf International Forum for inviting me into this very relevant and insightful discussion. I'm really feel pleased and honored to be in this such a distinguished panel. And I have myself learned a lot from my colleagues here. And I think that they have already discussed a lot of the variables which are affecting this crisis and prolonging this conflict. Still, I can add up some things here, which might be interesting for our audience. I think Sudan, as Dr. Khalid also suggested, it's in a way a virtual neighbor of the Gulf countries of the GCC broadly. Just the Red Sea Strip separates it from the GCC, but the economic and human linkages of Sudan, particularly with Saudi Arabia, and then if you go on to the UAE right now, they are massive and extensive, and the impact of changes within Sudan, they in a way will be felt in the GCC states, and similarly GCC changes within GCC, geopolitical tensions, struggles within the GCC member states are also felt within Sudan. We know as a fact that President Umer al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, he switched towards the GCC states and ended his long-term relationship with Iran, and got aid flows from GCC states. He also deployed Sudanese troops and the troops associated with the RSF in Yemen, and the return was good money for the Sudanese government, but also for groups like RSF. And I think, as our scholars pointed it out earlier, that this is where these groups started to become stronger, because they have a very lucrative stream of revenue, making them more stronger. But what has been, and I guess that one thing which really, in a manner, was critical as an outside factor in this situation was first, of course, the rift between GCC states, between Qatar and its neighbors. And I guess that during that rift, Sudan under Bashir was playing to some extent both sides, and Saudi Arabia and UAE were not really happy. And then I remember that when the protests started, he went to Qatar, and it was the geopolitical relationship, the geopolitical struggle, and the relationship between the Sudanese elites. It was very clear at that time who is supporting who and who is backing whom. So when his government was toppled, the Saudis and the Emiratis, of course, they I mean, they didn't care that he is gone, and this is the reality. But afterwards, of course, stakes we see within the GCC, the Emirati stakes became much far greater as compared to any other actor. Qatar, which was very influential or relevant under the Umar al-Bashir regime, gradually its influence was reduced, while we see that UAE, it was engaging with the new decision makers in Khartoum, but also it had an alternative connection with General Hemedti and his group. And also this connection was important for Emirati grand statecraft in the broader North Africa, in broader East Africa. So for the Emirates, Sudan was a very critical, you can say, peg in its geopolitical ambitions within the broader African continent and within the broader North and East Africa. And in this grand scheme of things, just like in Libya, Khalifa Haftar became an important actor. Similarly, in Sudan, Hemedti emerged as an important actor, and because of his presence in Darfur and the connections between Libya and Sudan, it was apparent that the UAE, you can say, scheme would not really materialize without the active functioning and coordination of these groupings. And I think this is where the whole, you can say, the bigger problem in the conflict lies. My colleagues have gone in depth in almost most of the variables playing a part. I think that right now, the mediation, you can say, effort is led by Saudi Arabia, and of course it is supported and backed by the United States as well. But what we see that Saudi Arabia itself doesn't have much of a ground presence within Sudan in terms of being such sort of pattern-client relationship with a local Sudanese actor. It's interesting that Saudi Arabia was thinking of investing heavily within Sudan, within projects of related to agriculture, also some projects of port development, and maybe some other projects related to livestock development. So we can see some trends relating to which directly correlate to Saudi food security. And then, of course, some because the investments were to be made by the Saudi Investment Fund, a public investment fund. So that showed that there was real something there within Sudan. But now this war has totally disrupted such plans. And I'll just think that if you are a Saudi decision maker, you will really be very negative about the people who have started this conflict and who are prolonging this. And then you are really eager to stop this conflict, because there was some very interesting commentary from a Saudi think tank. And one point they mentioned as critical in this conflict was that this conflict will directly will have a subsequent effect on both direct and indirect, both indirect, directly and indirectly, on the national security of the kingdom. And in addition to the political situation in Sudan, the negative effects will be felt on regional security and stability, especially in the Red Sea region, which is strategically vital for the future of kingdom. And the future of kingdom lies, as the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia says, in Neom. So imagine that if on the opposite shore of Neom, there is a full-fledged war going on, you will not really be happy. Another interesting thing to note here is that the Saudi mediation effort is collaborating and coordinating with the US, with GCC Secretariat. It's also collaborating with, I guess, I have heard, with the IGAD and others. But it's not coordinating and collaborating with the most important external player, from my understanding, in the conflict, which is the UAE. The UAE is not involved in this mediation effort. And the UAE, by default, I would say, is the actor which has the potential to put us, and has probably a finger on the switch to switch off resources towards RSF. I mean, maybe not in the short term, but in the longer term, because they are, in a way, directly depending upon cash inflows from the gold which is exported to the UAE. And I guess that this is really important, because, and I guess this was something which was in the mind of General Burhan and his foreign backers when General Burhan contacted the Emirati royals. I think it was Prince Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed at the start of the conflict, that just to, maybe it was about to get a nerve what the Emiratis are thinking, but also to check if they are keen on backing RSF or not. I think that in this complex geopolitical and local rivalries and patron-client relationships and proxy conflict, Emiratis will be the most important actors. And in a way, the Saudis need to think among themselves if this conflict is really positive for them, especially a long-term conflict. And if they understand that this is not really positive, then probably, other than trying to mediate between Burhan and Hemedti and other stakeholders, probably they'll also need to engage with Abu Dhabi and understand what are motivations there. I guess that, as Professor...
Omar, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. If you can wrap up in 30 seconds so we can move quickly to the Q&A.
Yeah, my last sentence was that, as Professor Khalid and others said, the resolution lies within the Gulf, as well as, of course, within Sudan, but the Gulf is really more.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving quickly, I have so many questions we received. I received six questions about the humanitarian situation, and Ms. Ahmadi, if you allow me, start with you and your experience. And right now, there is an ongoing atrocities happening in Darfur and in other areas, in other cities in Sudan. What are the solutions that you think could be proposed in Jeddah talks Is there responsibility to protect a tool that can be, I know this is ideal maybe, but is there a responsibility to protect tool that could be endorsed in the talks, since the Sudanese armed forces have so far failed to protect civilians? Is there any coalition that the Arab countries through the Arab League or the GCC states they can make to provide protection to fleeing refugees and displaced population? There are so many ideas coming in the questions, but I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Thank you, Anas, again. Well, in terms of humanitarian crisis, I think currently what is going on in Sudan, and particularly Darfur, is the worst humanitarian crisis in our history. And it seems like as long as the Jeddah talks concern, it seems like they're prioritizing more the generals rather than the people. And I think this approach has to be changed. They're not addressing the situation with the sense of urgency that it requires. People are dying in silence. Right now, people talking about thousands, but by the time they realize when the war ends, I think millions of people. Like most people, when the war started, like in Khartoum, out of 9+ million people, mostly people who have to go out on a daily basis to earn income to survive, that has stopped. The upper or lower middle classes who are relying on salaries is completely stopped. So people are dying inside their homes as a result of lack of access to basic needs, let alone those who are killed. In Darfur, there is no means of sustenance as the Janjaweed use the tools of blocking access, looting food, destroying hospitals, taking ambulance, taking health supply from pharmacies. So the need is unimaginably huge right now, and it is time to move. So last week, over 40 Darfuri organizations have signed a letter to the member state of the Security Council, the African Union, asking for Darfur to be placed under international trusteeship because 20 years of genocide, there's no resolution, there's no government right now in Sudan. It's just like you and I, let us agree. If two people are fighting, prioritizing themselves rather than the people, then that's not government. There's no functioning government. In Darfur, there is nothing other than two state governors who may end up, and I hope not, in the same fate out of Khamis Bakr, who has been targeted and killed. So the need is important. Also, the need of those who cross the border in Chad. It is a rainy season. These people fled barefoot, only with clothing in there themselves. So they are in need, and the UN agencies move really slow. Like everyone who could come down to aid these people to survive is required to be down there. So bureaucracy does not help, it only helps the perpetrators. I think there is a need for shift in addressing Sudan within atrocity prevention approach rather than traditional conflict resolution. How many peace agreements have been negotiated over the years since the Darfur crisis, South Kordofan, the Blue Nile, now the 2019? It didn't work. I think for the Gulf states, I'm afraid that the Sudanese people are not too well right now, the negative impact that the states, they have to take a radical approach to show the Sudanese people otherwise, and also the role in the region, either like neither the League of Arab States and or the Gulf state have a history of successful conflict resolution in the region. Look at the cases of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria. I think they need players in this state need to change their mindset, get out of their box if they are to demonstrate to their own people and to people in the region and to the Sudanese people that they can play a successful role. Cutting support for their either party. People think the initiative is not neutral because they both have history and relationship with both the war in Yemen has partially like this crisis is created by the war in Yemen. The money that have been deployed to these two generals it didn't go to any like benefit of the Sudanese people, even those who went to fight by proxy and died there. So that has to be changed. Egypt and Saudi are fighting over like being the major player in the region, and that also a problem. They both need to rethink if you need to have a stable neighbor, and a democratic country is the most sustainable rather than a military or like a militia state. That is not going to work. Right now, this issue becoming a regional issue whereby multinational troops involved. I think without regional and international intervention, it's not going to be resolved. And when I say atrocity prevention approach, first, boots on the ground, protect the people, stop the killing, allow humanitarian access. With the current situation, even if people are given visas and they get down there, nobody will be able to provide humanitarian assistance when they humanitarian themselves are under attack. Then accountability. What is going on in Sudan is a cost of immunity, actually. And accountability for past and present crime must be prioritized. Then these two steps will create an enabling environment for peace to be negotiated. Then the peace making will create an enabling environment for democratic transformation, whereby civil society, women, youth groups, and those who are willing to transform Sudan. What we need in Sudan is system transformation, not system maintenance. And what is done by our neighbors, and unfortunately the Gulf state, is system maintenance, which it doesn't work. We tried it for 20 plus years, it doesn't work. For the US, and I will stop there, the United States really has been losing leadership in Sudan, and I think they need also to get out of their box. Since 2009, 2010, they followed Qatar leadership. Qatar has no experience in resolving any single crisis. They have been in the shadow of our regional player, trying, we want to let the people in the region lead. No, US, they are the leading government in the world. That leadership needs to be seen in resolving such a crisis. And I think Sudan is very strategic, too big to let fail. And at the stake, with Sudan being a country with a history of being a hub for terrorists, these militias are a good ingredient for that. And if they let them get into the mountains of Darfur, it is the regional and the international actors will be forced to fight. By then, if they are not fighting for the people of Sudan, they will be fighting for their own national security. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Khalid, you have given important figures about GCC states' investments in Sudan. How do you think, you mentioned that they are the major investors in the country. How do you think these FDIs or different types of investments could direct or influence their efforts to control this conflict, either in a good or a negative way? You're muted.
Thank you for the question. I had to take a couple of seconds because I agree with everything that Niemat said, Ms. Niemat, and I think that we should really revisit that. If you don't mind me also saying that at this point now, there's serious discussion of Chapter 7, which of course is always difficult to implement because of the Security Council, but nevertheless, this discussion that she poses about intervention is what Sudanese and others are talking about now. The situation is just too severe, and the consequences now are clear to people. So that, I think, is extremely important. In terms of the issue of, I want to return to what Umer said among his many insights. One of them was the rivalries between the different groups. The biggest problem for the GCC and the Gulf countries in resolving the Sudan conflict has to do, number one, with, I do believe, the lack of vision and what Niemat said. Number two, of course, the strategic and economic interest, and of course, the lack of cohesiveness and shared vision, and the competition between, frankly, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. What Umer said, and he prioritized or emphasized that it's Saudi Arabia that's the big player. And that's also the case in terms of formal investment, where Saudi Arabia will have, for 35 billion or so, and the others spread out. The United Arab Emirates, in terms of foreign direct investment, has quite little, about 500 or so, although it has a lot of land investment. What that means is that UAE has historically really been interested, if I can put it bluntly, in the informal smuggling of commodities, including, of course, gold, much of which, of course, goes into the Dubai markets. And here it's very, very important. Where Saudi Arabia, at least from the financial and economic portfolio, is interested in a stable Sudan, however they envision that, I wouldn't say because of the strategic and financial interest of private actors and others in the UAE that they have really stability in their calculations. And that's extremely dangerous. And that also speaks to the very heart, if you don't mind me saying, I've known the GCC from the 1980s, and that is the problem of the GCC in terms of the lack of cohesiveness, the lack of discussion in terms of the internal rivalries that has bedeviled the GCC to come up and to meet its objectives and missions. This is why I had repeated that Sudan is actually a test case, not only for Sudan, but very centrally also to the GCC and the Gulf countries. Can they get around the table and realize, as Niemat really articulated, that everyone is a loser here? That the lack of stability has reached such a level that they can't even meet their strategic, let alone their economic interests. And that, I think, is a discussion I cannot have, we cannot have. That is a discussion that has to be done in the context of the Gulf countries themselves and their capitals. Having said that, because of their particular strategic interest and, let's say, their conflict, or the UAE does have, of course, interest in $6 billion in the port, but that has nothing to do with a domestic investment in the domestic economy. That is, once again, I would rank that as informal rather than something that is the UAE invested in Sudan, in Sudan's stability. And that becomes really important. And I know I want to give opportunity for others, but the other thing has to do with who is really going to help to resolve this conflict. And I'm going to go out in a bit of a limb here. And I would say that for me, teaching African politics and conflict resolution in Africa, the role of ECOWAS in West Africa, in West African conflicts, for example, has been much more positive. And there are two reasons. One of them is, as I said, I really cannot emphasize this enough, that African countries, and they do have their interests, are actually familiar with, number two, issues of conflict and post-conflict settings and issues of security sector reform, because we come from a country of weaker states than the Arab countries. And number two, they have a sustained interest in the stability of these countries. And finally, and most importantly, the majority of African countries, I think people are unaware, are actually governed by democratic institutions of one type or another. In other words, African countries are not unfamiliar with transitions to democracy. And that is why, let's say, the role of Kenya can be potentially good. This is not to take away the really organic and substantive linkages with the Arab countries and the Gulf. And that's why I began with the translating Bab and Mandam. The notion that, as many Sudanese would like, to actually jettison the Gulf countries outside of Sudanese politics is an impossibility. As much as we may, some quarters may say that is useful. For a variety of historical, strategic, economic reasons, that is not possible. And what Umer said was really interesting, and that is because of that, the Gulf countries actually have a very important role to play in resolving the conflict. But now we have to have a discussion of the role of the IGAD and the African Union, how they can be supported. If there is intervention because of the complications of Chapter 7, actually it's African countries that have intervened, sidestepping Chapter 7 and the legal issues associated with the Security Council. And so we have to have a really serious discussion of the international intervention, because the humanitarian crisis now, and I know that this is up for debate, many Sudanese and others are concerned and fearful of an international external intervention. But I think Niemat, and I would have to defer to her here, although I have gone to that forum many times, I think we have to have a discussion of the proper type of humanitarian intervention to stop this kind of massacres. And that's a discussion we have to really begin to talk about seriously.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. I'll stay on the topic of IGAD and different African actors or actors in Africa. Egypt and IGAD Do you think they can? This is a question to anyone. Do you think they can play a positive role? Because stability in Sudan is absolutely of their best interest, particularly Egypt. And do you think also we can see a conflict between Egypt and the UAE, considering they are backing different parties, unlike what we've seen in Libya? They are backing different parties in Sudan. And there is also the Chinese role. China in 2000, in the previous genocide in Sudan, they vetoed more than once UN Security Council that aimed to send peacekeepers to Darfur. I think I can't remember the number exactly, but I remember it was more than one UN Security Council. What are their stakes in the current conflict? Do you think they can influence, particularly when we are influence a resolution for this conflict, particularly that we are talking about Chapter 7 as one of the options, which requires a voting at the UN Security Council? These are several questions. Please feel if you have something to say about it, or if you have an answer to enlighten us.
Gonna try speaking.
Yes, please.
Okay. I still hear my voice.
Okay.
I don't like my voice very much.
Okay.
What you just mentioned about Egypt and IGAD, and just as Ms. Ahmadi highlighted, sorry, it was Khalid Medani highlighted, like Africa does have a decent experience with transitions to democracy, where Egypt right now is part of its outcomes hoped for in Sudan is never having a democracy on its southern border. And that's a very important point here. Egypt is hell-bent on not having a democratic state on its southern borders, and that is actually very, very detrimental to their work with African countries, including and members of IGAD, on finding a solution to the Sudan conflict. As much as we said, has been highlighted that the UAE has to be part of the solution, Egypt has to be made to be part of the solution as well, because their investment and in a certain outcome is absolutely detrimental to long-term stability in Sudan. We're going to have insurgency all over Sudan for a very, very long time, unless that is contained. Sorry, I keep again hearing my own voice and it's delayed. It's very distracting. Unless that insurgency is contained right now by cutting off all the funders of these insurgencies from the region. UAE is responsible for part of that, but Egypt is also very, very much responsible for some of the insurgency that we will see, regardless of who wins this short-term war. With that, I will stop talking because I just can't take it anymore.
Yeah, I think just one 30 seconds to wrap up. Africa's involvement, like what we see right now, I think it's IGAD, but not IGAD alone. IGAD and AU have to work together because of the involvement of multinational or transnational troops from this West African country. I think West Africa has an important role to play, and they must be brought on board. And the support from international community, the United States, Chadian government has played a greater role by housing the refugees, but also blocking its eastern borders, which is limiting the flow of internal displaced. I think also players have to exercise pressure over Libyan, the Haftar, General Haftar, and its support for Hemedti. Right now, Libya is being used as the Sudanese-Libyan border to bring more weapons and more fighters from other countries. So I think it is very important to have these players. And as Mohamed mentioned, I echo what you said. Egypt has to be there is a need for a bold stand from this AU IGAD to put Egypt in its place to play a positive role. Otherwise, Egypt will be out of like losing the opportunity of being a player in this. And I think it become a must right now. The real fear that now Africans, they just start understanding the complication of especially these multinational troops in Darfur and across the Sudan too.
Thank you, Ms. Ahmadi. Uh, China, anyone would like to say anything about China? And I would like to address China and the Red Sea before we move to concluding remarks. Particularly Port Sudan, and I know it was a target for Russian base a few years ago. It was put on hold eventually, and I think particularly I would like to link it to resumptions of relations with the U.S. After Khartoum resumed relations with Washington. It was put on hold. But Port Sudan, we can't ignore its importance, whether in the recent evacuation to Jeddah, the evacuation operation that happened, and it's also its proximity to Chinese base in Djibouti as well. So many geopolitical factors to be considered in case this crisis. Hopefully not, but in case this crisis went for more than we hope.
Can I take the opportunity? Yeah, I think that the Chinese, just like any other global actor, maybe minus Russia, would not be really happy to see this conflict blowing out of proportion, or and particularly, I think something crucial for them is Red Sea security. Red Sea security landscape. We have already seen attacks across the Somali coast on shipping, on private shipping and shipping lanes broadly. And if something of a similar proportion starts happening along the Sudanese coast, then that would be a big problem for all the private shipping that is going through the Red Sea. And since for China this is a very important waterway, it would really not want that sort of anarchy and mayhem to be within along to be the norm alongside the coast of Sudan. So what I think, and I think this would be similar for, of course, the United States and European Union actors, and because all of them many of them have a presence in Djibouti, so indirectly their presence in Djibouti would then be affected by developments here, but also for the Saudis, and to some extent also for the Emiratis. So I guess this is why we have seen the city of Port Sudan staying in the hands of the actor which is in control. And I guess probably there will be some sort of de facto arrangement or an underhand deal within those involved in this conflict, that Port Sudan remains a stable point of entry and exit for deliberations, and also for any future evacuations or any future parlays. But the interesting, or the bigger question mark would be, what about rest of the coast? Who will be in control of all of this coastal area, and what's the guarantee that other extremist groups, they start doing their own thing in these waters? And I guess that this is where international actors such as China would be really keen to push and to back, of course, the Saudi mediated talks, but also maybe to privately reach out to different actors involved in the conflict, because as all the distinguished colleagues said, this is a conflict which is very much in the nitty-gritties. There are a lot of local actors with a lot of conflicting interests involved here, and then also regional actors with a relatively conflicting interests involved here. So in a manner for them, all of them to agree on something, it will be really difficult. But for that to happen, I guess almost all of the regional and international actors, and of course African Union and IGAD, maybe African Union and IGAD should reach out to the GCC Secretariat and push states like Kuwait and Qatar and Oman, which have played a mediation role within the GCC disputes as well, to create lines of communications within the actors from the GCC who have maybe conflicting interests. So I guess that even the mediators need to talk with parties which probably they think are on their side. Only then there can be comprehensive solution. But as Niemat said, the humanitarian ceasefires and humanitarian intervention, there has to be some sort of that happening as well.
Thank
if
you.
If I can just say quickly, yeah,
please. Yeah, please.
Because to piggyback on Umer about the port and the Red Sea, historically it has determined the politics of the entire region. I'm not going to rehearse the long history of British colonialism, which actually started the informal militia forces in Sudan. Because of their competition with Egypt following the revolution of 1919 in Egypt. I just want to kind of emphasize how important that strategic location has been for the fate of Sudan. But having said that, I think what's really important is that the changing rivalries or geostrategic relations are going to be determinant of the stability and security of the Red Sea. And I think what maybe Umer suggested is that the kind of realignment of allies around the Red Sea area, potentially all of these actors are interested in securing these massive, very important strategic waterways. But there have been rivalries that have not worked, whether it's Turkey trying to fight for it, the UAE is a private company. There have been many different rivalries in the Red Sea. I think there has been a problem in the fact that domestically there hasn't been a reliable actor in Khartoum that has been able to implement these agreements. The last one is really private actors with the UAE. And I want to mention two things quickly. One of them is the people actually live in the Red Sea area and the port, and they have protested against the privatization of the Red Sea. The best way to really understand that is that there's much more stability in the future if there is a formal legal cooperation, not with respect to private corporations, but countries, because it's a strategic, internationally strategic waterway. And that's why it has been an unstable region. Another issue returns us to democracy. Why has no power been able to secure that port effectively for stability? And that is that the Umar Bashir regime and the one that came after has not been a reliable partner. Where that leads us to is continued support of the democratic kind of transition and a legitimate government that is able to secure the security of the Red Sea for all parties involved. If, as we see now, there's a thaw relations between the Gulf, Saudi Arabia in particular, and Iran and even Turkey, then those kind of rivalries really point to this rapprochement that can happen. That is an agreement around what we call international cooperation or regional cooperation. It may be too hopeful to say that right now, but I think that argument can be made that a regional cooperation is possible around the Red Sea if these countries not only understand that there's a strategic interest, but that they have an interest in cooperating with each other over the stability of the Red Sea port and that area.
Thank you so much. Concluding remarks, just in 1 minute, if each one of you kindly can mention what are the priorities that should be right now in Jeddah talks. I think they are meeting, they went, if I'm not mistaken, they will be meeting today or tomorrow. What should be priorities right now? In 1 minute, starting with you, Mrs. Ahmadi. Ms. Ahmadi.
Okay, great. What the priority, I do believe, as I said before, is that not negotiating ceasefire because it has never been abided by or implemented. So that approach has to be changed unless a miracle happened that the mediators change their role and show that they can exercise pressure over the two parties. But I think other actors already making up their mind of moving into having a different approach. So just to say, and I think having a different approach at this moment, it is of paramount importance to stop what is happening on the ground. Then after that, it is too soon to talk about negotiation because any negotiation is not going to succeed. And also, it's quite important to know that both parties who are currently fueling war in Sudan should not be part of any solution. I think accountability is the best approach to take to make sure that if people disagree in Sudan, they need to go to court, not to pick up arms. And that's something that we all have to fight for as Sudanese and also our neighbors and our allies who want to see a stable Sudan. And I also want to send a message that if there is anything, any venue is supposed to be about the people, not about the generals, because they do not have the people's interest at heart. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for this opportunity, and I look forward to another opportunity to collaborate.
Thank you. Dr. Medani, in 1 minute.
In 1 minute, absolutely. Let's. This is such an important question. The first priority, of course, is humanitarian forms of humanitarian intervention to stop these massacres, not in Darfur, in Khartoum, throughout the country. I think that responsibility to protect discussion is important. But the second priority is a change of vision, as Ms. Ahmadi said. That is that an understanding that this conflict is of a particular nature. It's between two military institutions, and the raison d'être of these two military leaders is political power, absolutely, and the retaining of a mass amount of wealth that they amassed in illicit ways. So understanding that is really important. Why is that important to understand the roots of the conflict in this way? Because that then enables people to prioritize bringing in the civilian actors, which is key, not later, but now, and doing so by applying particular pressure. Despite this kind of violence is really always a result, believe it or not, counterintuitively, of the weakness of these two actors, not their strength. A strong authoritarian military regime has control and stability over its country. What is happening now are two deeply weakened military leaders and institutions. And these kind of weakened institutions are not like in other countries nearby. They are prone to pressure. They will succumb to pressure. We need stronger pressure in terms of targeted sanctions as a part of a package, including diplomatic pressure. And that actually can work if there is coherence among international actors that understand that this is a threat to all of them, including a big threat to the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. I believe that the Gulf countries are quickly beginning to understand, and they're actually looking even to the IGAD finally as maybe a good partner to have that, including in addition to the US. So that is really important. With that pressure, then we can we return to what are the roots of the conflicts, issues of security sector reform, bringing in civil society groups to not only implement but design the ceasefire, and then have serious discussions about dismantling a state that has now fallen apart. And the reason it has fallen apart is because it hasn't been able to provide the public goods and basic services to its population. So justice, security sector reform, and adding also what the revolution was about, a dismantling the deep state in the country. All of that must be on the table. The two leaders are trying to do everything to distract the international community from the important issues that the revolution was about. And we cannot buy into that, if you don't mind me saying.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you. Mohamed, in 1 minute, what do you think
like
should be
everything that is worth saying already, but I will just add to that that I would love to see all these states who are stakeholders in what's happening in Sudan, as well as more removed states such as the Europeans, to really start acting out of self-interest and support a serious people-centered intervention and not one that is not about these generals. Those who invested in making the RSF was what it is today, be it the GCC countries and the Europeans also, who have been working to embolden RSF through their for their own immigration interests, should really act out of self-interest right now, because as I said earlier, this war has not begun yet. The effects have not been felt by any of them yet, but it will be felt. If they thought Syria produced a refugee crisis for Europe, think again about what is coming out of Sudan if this war is not contained right now. Those in the GCC, playing this dangerous game, should also really reconsider what could happen if Sudan reach peak conflict. This is not it; it's only coming. And Egypt should also really, reevaluate its positions on Sudan, because unlike Egypt, Sudan will never be ruled by a military. It's not the same. We're not the same country. We might be. There is a lot of geographical proximity, but there is a fundamental difference between Sudan and the makeup of Sudan and the makeup of Egypt. Sudan will not accept a Sisi outcome in Sudan. Young people in Sudan will not invite Islamists back to power. This is not happening. This is not gonna end with stability if the army just wins the way Sisi would like the army to win. They really all should come to the table and come to support their own self-interest, and their self-interest will be served by a stable, democratic Sudan, one that actually fulfills the vision of more people in Sudan.
Thank you, Mohamed. Omar, the final word is yours.
Sure. I'll just say that maybe the talks should also include Egypt and UAE. So those mediating have a bigger and a better understanding of what are the stakes of some other actors at play, and maybe the mediators should move forward, as our colleague suggested, from a ceasefire-oriented approach, which is basically you take this, and stop fighting, kind of an approach to a more comprehensive resolution of this conflict, but also the return to the normalization of the Sudanese state, which is basically right now splintering into factionalism and warlordism. So yeah, we can only hope.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar. Thank you all. This was very informative and rich panel. It left us with many ideas and thoughts about the conflict in Sudan and the safety of the Sudanese people, and the GCC state's role and interests in a stable, democratic Sudan. Again, thank you, and I hope that you can join us in future programs at Gulf International Forum. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.